Good morning, friends. Oh, okay. We are on chapter 9. Forgive my crazy hair. Blockheaded British. On a sunny July day in 1952, 8 months after his return from Washington, Prime Minister Mossadegh was driven along an elm-shaded lane to the Saad Abad Palace for a showdown with Mohammad Reza Shah. Iran was no longer big enough for both of them. Behind closed doors at the palace, they faced off in a duel of wits and power. It ended with Mossadegh lying unconscious at the Shah's feet. This meeting was supposed to be no more than ceremonial. Mossadegh had just been chosen by the Majlis to serve a full 2-year term as Prime Minister, and according to custom he was presenting the Shah with a list of his cabinet ministers. He took the occasion, however, to make a demand that no Iranian Prime Minister had ever dared to make. Mossadegh wanted the Shah to recognize the supremacy of the elected government by surrendering control of the War Ministry. The Shah was outraged. Without the War Ministry, he would lose control of the army, the bulwark of his power, and be reduced to the status of a figurehead. Rather than lose his army, he told Mossadegh he would pack my suitcase and leave. Mossadegh, who had mastered the art of political theater before the Shah was born, said not a word. He paused for a few moments to reflect, then rose to walk out. The Shah was struck with fear that the old man would take to the streets and rouse the masses against him. He jumped up, ran to the door, and threw his body across it. Mossadegh insisted that he step aside. Impossible, the Shah replied. Their discussion must continue. The standoff lasted for a moment or two. Mossadegh began breathing harder. Then he gasped, took a few steps back, and fainted. An annex to the 1906 Constitution made the Shah supreme commander of the Iranian army, but also required him to cooperate with the elected government on political matters. Prime ministers had traditionally interpreted this as allowing the Shah to appoint the Minister of War. By breaking with this tradition, Mossadegh provoked a crisis. As he lay in bed, recovering from his collapse, he decided to resolve it in a way that shocked the country. The next morning, July 17th, he resigned from office. Under the present circumstances, it is impossible to conclude the final phase of the national struggle, he wrote to the Shah. I cannot continue in office without having responsibility for the Ministry of War, and since your Majesty did not concede this, I feel I do not enjoy the confidence of the sovereign, and therefore offer my resignation to pave the way for another government which might be able to carry out your Majesty's wishes. Did Mossadegh really wish to leave power, or was he just maneuvering for political advantage? At several crucial moments in his career, he had chosen to retire from public life rather than sully himself. He was so mortified by the Anglo-Persian Agreement of 1919 that he applied for residence in Switzerland and told his family he would live the rest of his life in exile. During the long reign of Reza Shah, he remained absolutely aloof from politics. In 1947, after an election reform bill he had proposed in the Majlis was defeated, he retired to his estate in Ahmadabad and announced the definitive end of his political life. These episodes reflected a martyr's streak in Mossadegh, perhaps reinforced by Shiite theology that disposed him to choose stoic suffering over compromise with iniquity. This guy's nuts. By the middle of 1952, Mossadegh was facing many troubles. Britain's boycott of Iranian oil had been devastatingly effective, and he knew that British agents in Tehran were working to subvert his government. For a time he hoped to ride out the crisis with American aid, but President Truman, who was under heavy pressure from London, would not give him any. He sought help from the World Bank, but that effort also failed. Iranians were becoming poorer and unhappier by the day. Mossadegh's political coalition was fraying, and in his new term he could look forward to fighting a swarm of enemies. It would be naive, however, to believe that Mossadegh was truly eager to leave the exalted position he had reached in the eyes of Iranians and millions of others around the world. He wanted not to quit, but to force Iranians to decide whether they really wanted him as their leader. Resigning was an inspired gamble. For most of that spring, Mossadegh had been preoccupied with parliamentary elections. He had little to fear from a free vote, since despite the country's problems, he was widely admired as a hero. A free vote, however, was not what others were planning. British agents had fanned out across the country, bribing candidates and regional bosses who controlled them. They hoped to fill the Majlis with deputies who would vote to depose Mossadegh. It would be a coup carried out by seemingly legal means. Iranian elections took several weeks to complete because of difficulties in transportation and communication. The first results came from big cities, and they were encouraging to Mossadegh. In Tehran, all 12 National Front candidates were elected. Results in other parts of the country where there was no one to monitor the voting, were quite different. These results did not in themselves disturb Mossadegh, whose faith in the popular will was boundless. But he became worried after violence broke out in Abadan and several other parts of the country where elections were being hotly contested. Aides told him that some of the candidates being elected were under the direct control of British agents. He was about to leave for The Hague to defend Iran against another British lawsuit at the World Court, and feared that his absence might remove the last checks on his enemy's electoral chicanery. I don't know that word, chicanery. In June, after 80 candidates had been certified as winners of seats in the 136-seat Majlis, his cabinet voted to halt the elections. In a statement, he asserted that since foreign agents were exploiting the election campaign to destabilize Iran, the supreme national interests of the country necessitate the suspension of elections pending the return of the Iranian delegation from The Hague. Mossadegh was legally entitled to take this step as long as the 80 seated members did not veto it, which they did not. He could also claim a measure of moral legitimacy, since he was defending Iran against subversion by outsiders. Nevertheless, the episode cast him in an unflattering light. It allowed his critics to portray him as undemocratic and grasping for personal power. Also, Mossadegh dealt with this challenge. He also had to face another that most Iranians considered far more urgent. Their country was spiraling into bankruptcy. Tens of thousands had lost their jobs at the Abadan refinery. And although most understood and passionately supported the idea of nationalization, they naturally hoped that Mossadegh would find a way to put them back to work. The only way he could do that was to sell oil. During the first half of 1952, tankers from Argentina and Japan managed to make their way into and out of Iranian ports despite Britain's proclaimed embargo. Another brought 4,000 tons of Abadan oil to Venice. And after an Italian court rejected Britain's protest, Winston Churchill complained about what paltry friends and allies the Italians are. Churchill realized that if he did not enforce the embargo more effectively, it would collapse. In mid-June, dock workers at the Persian Gulf port of Bandar Mashur welcomed the tanker Rosemary, which had been chartered by a private Italian oil company that wanted to buy 20 million tons of Iranian crude over the next decade. The company had organized this experimental voyage to challenge Britain's embargo, and if the Rosemary could make her way safely back to Italy, the embargo would be broken, and Iran would be on the road to economic recovery. As Britain and Iran prepared for confrontation on the high seas, they also clashed at the World Court. The British were seeking an order declaring that Abadan refinery and surrounding oil fields rightfully belonged to them. Their lawyers argued eloquently, but any hope that they had of dominating the proceedings vanished when Mossadegh arrived. A crowd welcomed him at the Peace Palace, cheering wildly and rhythmically, chanting his name. Inside, he gave a brief speech asking the judges to consider the moral and political aspects of the case as well as the strictly legal ones. Nationalizing Anglo-Iranian, he said, had been the only possible response to an intolerable situation in which the company had for years treated its Iranian employees like animals and manipulated Iranian governments to assure that it could continue plundering the country's most precious natural resource. After his speech, Mossadegh retired to his hotel and did not appear again in court. Iran's case was presented over the course of 3 days by a team of Iranian lawyers and an eminent Belgian, Henry Rollin, a professor of international law and former president of the Belgian Senate. Over and over, Rollin returned to his central argument. The court had no authority in the case, he asserted, because it concerned not two nations, but a nation and a private company. Mossadegh was at his hotel when news came that British warships had intercepted the Rosemary and forced her to port at the British Protectorate of Aden. In a court there, British lawyers argued that Anglo-Iranian was the legal owner of all Iranian oil, and that therefore the Rosemary was carrying stolen property. The verdict, which to no one's surprise was in Britain's favor, did not come for several months, but news that the Royal Navy was now intercepting tankers carrying Iranian oil was enough to scare off other customers. Mossadegh called a new conference to denounce the seizure, which he called a vivid example of the way Britain is attempting to strangle us. Many Europeans were sympathetic. I fear Dr. Mossadegh has managed to leave behind him in The Hague a generally favorable impression, the British ambassador cabled home to London. Britain's seizure of the Rosemary was a devastating blow to Mossadegh and his government. No oil company would now do business with Iran, so the country's main source of income was gone. Iran had earned $45 million from oil exports in 1950, more than 70% of its total export earnings. That sum dropped by half in 1951 and then almost to zero in 1952. Mossadegh told Iranians that their campaign for national dignity required deprivation, self-sacrifice, and loyalty. Although most agreed, they suffered nonetheless. He eased their pain by promoting the export of products other than oil, especially textiles and foodstuffs, and by negotiating barter agreements with several countries. These and other steps kept Iran from collapsing, but they were no substitute for the income that oil exports would have earned. The divisive election, the tightening British oil embargo, and the World Court case all weighed on Mossadegh's mind as he returned home from The Hague at the end of June. 2 weeks later he had his fainting fit in the Shah's salon, and the next day resigned his office. His resignation was a godsend for his British enemies and for the Shah. They had hoped to manipulate the Majlis into blocking his re-election. Now he had done them the unimaginable favor of leaving on his own accord. British officials had chosen the man they wished to succeed Mossadegh. He was the wily 72-year-old politician Ahmad Kavam, who had served as prime minister in the mid-1940s. The British scholar agent Stephen Zinzer reported from his post in Tehran that it was Kavam's desire to work closely with the British and to preserve their legitimate interests in Persia. He greatly preferred that British influence should be exercised in Persia rather than that of the Americans, who were foolish and without experience, and that of the Russians, who were Persia's enemies. At first, the Shah was reluctant to support Kavam. His experience with Mossadegh had soured him on strong prime ministers, and he wanted one who was weak and pliable. Kavam was neither. The British, however, insisted on him. In the hours after Mossadegh submitted his resignation on July 17th, the Shah mused inconclusively about how to proceed. That night, a group of 40 pro-British Majlis members met and nominated Kavam. 27 others gathered nearby to declare their undying loyalty to Mossadegh, the only figure capable of ruling Iran at this momentous time in our history. In the end, the Shah succumbed to British pressure, as he was wont to do, and accepted Kavam. Foolishly believing that he had won a firm mandate, Kavam immediately began issuing harsh proclamations declaring that the day of retribution had come. He denounced Mossadegh for failing to resolve the oil crisis and for launching a widespread campaign against a foreign state. Iran, he declared, was about to change. This helmsman is on a different course. He declared in his first statement as prime minister, anyone who objected to his new policies would be arrested and delivered into the heartless and pitiless hands of the law. Many Iranians did not realize that Mossadegh was really out of power until they heard Kavam deliver this proclamation over the radio. It triggered an explosion of protest. Crowds poured into the streets of Tehran and other cities chanting, "Ya Murd Ya! Ya Murd Ya Mossadegh! Death or Mossadegh!" Kavam ordered the police to attack and suppress them, and many officers refused. Many joined the protesters and were joyfully embraced. This spontaneous outburst was, above all, an expression of support for Mossadegh's decision to confront the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. Many Iranians, however, were also drawn to him because of his commitment to social reform. Mossadegh had freed peasants from forced labor on their landlords' estates, ordered factory owners to pay benefits to sick and injured workers, established a system of unemployment compensation, and taken 20% of the money landlords received in rent and placed it in a fund to pay for development projects like pest control, rural housing, and public baths. He supported women's rights, defended religious freedom, and allowed courts and universities to function freely. Oh, I love him. Above all, he was known even by his enemies as scrupulously honest and impervious to the corruption that pervaded Iranian politics. The prospect of losing him so suddenly, and of having him replaced by a regime evidently sponsored from abroad, was more than his aroused people would accept. On July 21st, National Front leaders called for a general strike to show the nation's opposition to Kavam and support for Mossadegh, the only popular choice to lead the national struggle. Within hours, much of the country was paralyzed. Ayatollah Kashani, who had learned that Kavam planned to arrest him, issued a fatwa ordering soldiers to join the rebellion, which he called a holy war against the imperialists. Tuta militants, still angry at Kavam for engineering the withdrawal of Soviet troops from Azerbaijan in 1947, eagerly joined the fray with cries of "Down with the Shah! We want a People's Republic!" Kavam and the Shah were shocked by this rebellion and responded by calling out elite military units. Soldiers opened fire on protesters in several parts of Tehran. Dozens fell dead. Young military officers, appalled by the carnage, began talking of mutiny. The Shah had completely lost control of the situation. His only choice was to ask for Kavam's resignation. Kavam submitted it at 4 o'clock that afternoon. Upon receiving it, the Shah sent for Mossadegh. Their meeting was unexpectedly cordial. The Shah said he was now prepared to accept Mossadegh as prime minister and give him control of the war ministry. He asked if Mossadegh still wished to maintain the monarchy. Mossadegh assured him that he did, presuming of course that kings would accept the supremacy of elected leaders. You could go down in history as an immensely popular monarch if you cooperated with democratic and nationalist forces, he told the Shah. The next day the Majlis voted overwhelmingly to re-elect Mossadegh as prime minister. Kavam's term had lasted just 4 days. His fall on Bloody Monday was a huge, almost unimaginable victory for Iranian nationalists. It was an even greater personal triumph for Mossadegh. Without having given a single speech or even stirred from his home, he had been returned to power by a grateful nation. Have a good day, friends.